Hi, I'm Jack Zhang for the Armchair Historian, and today I'll be discussing the Battle of the Wilderness, the first clash between Grant and Lee in the Civil War. Distinguished by vicious and confused close-range fighting, the Battle of the Wilderness involved nearly 180,000 Union and Confederate soldiers and resulted in 29,000 casualties, setting a bloody standard for the rest of the overland campaign. Though Grant launched repeated attacks against Lee, the battle was ultimately a stalemate because poor coordination between Grant's units and the wooded terrain prevented him from bringing his superior numbers to bear. In March 1864, President Lincoln promoted Ulysses S. Grant, the premier Union commander in the Western Theater, to the newly created rank of lieutenant general, giving him command of all the Union armies. Since Lee was his most dangerous adversary, Grant decided to accompany the Army of the Potomac in the upcoming spring campaign. His goal was to destroy Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and he was willing to fight a war of attrition if necessary. Known for his aggressiveness and propensity for taking risks, Lee was the cornerstone of the Confederacy in the East, and he had triumphed time and again versus larger Union armies. Going into the spring campaign, he had a mixed bag of corps commanders. James Longstreet, head of the First Corps, was his trusted lieutenant and had accompanied him since the Army's inception. Richard Ewell, of the Second Corps, was also a competent leader, though he could be indecisive at times. Likewise, A.P. Hill of the Third Corps had been an excellent division commander earlier in the war, but he had not lived up to expectations since assuming corps command. Moreover, his frail health was a constant concern. The other variable was Jeb Stuart, the dashing leader of Lee's cavalry corps. Concurrently, Meade was gearing up for battle as well. To streamline the army, he disbanded the 1st and 3rd Corps, both of which had sustained heavy casualties at Gettysburg, and used them to bolster the 2nd, 5th, and 6th Corps, which he placed under the command of his three top generals, Winfield Hancock, Gouverneur Warren, and John Sedgwick, respectively. Leading the cavalry corps was a newcomer named Philip Sheridan, while a familiar name, Ambrose Burnside, led the independent 9th Corps. By early May, Grant's forces numbered close to 120,000 men, giving him a 2-to-1 edge against Lee. However, the two armies were more evenly matched than they appeared. Specifically, Grant had about as many veterans as Lee, while the remainder of his army consisted of greenhorns and garrison troops, who were little more than cannon fodder. Throughout the winter and early spring, Lee had stationed Ewell's and Hill's corps near the Rapidan, across from the enemy camps at Brandy Station and Culpeper Courthouse. When Longstreet's corps returned from its stint in the Western Theater on April 20th, it encamped near Gordonsville in order to maintain a link with Richmond via the railroad. Around midnight, Grant's army began leaving its camps, and at 6 a.m., the first elements of the Second Corps started crossing at Ely's Ford. Shortly thereafter, the Fifth Corps started crossing at Germanna Ford. When Grant and Meade crossed there around noon, the Fifth Corps had vanished into the woods, and the Sixth Corps was marching across the pontoon bridges. By 3:30 p.m., the various corps had reached their objectives and were setting up camp. Unbeknownst to Grant, Lee was aware of his movements thanks to his sharp-eyed observers in Stuart's cavalry. Consequently, Lee ordered Ewell's and Hill's corps, except for Anderson's division, which would stay behind to guard the river, to start heading east on the Orange Turnpike and Orange Plank Road respectively. This put them on a collision course with the Union Army. Warren's Fifth Corps set out at 5 a.m., marching west toward Parker's store, an abandoned country market 5 miles down the road. Perhaps an hour later, pickets reported enemy troops on the turnpike, and Warren immediately notified headquarters of this unexpected development. Meade responded by ordering him to halt his advance, the first of several poor decisions he would make that day. Meanwhile, Grant had arrived at Meade's headquarters, and he was not pleased with the army's lack of progress, to say the least. Therefore, he assumed tactical command and issued new orders to get the army moving. since Hill's corps was bearing down on the Brock Road intersection and Hancock was still miles away. He dispatched Brigadier General George Getty's 6th Corps Division to block its path. Marching south as fast as possible, Getty's troops reached the intersection just in time to stop Hill's skirmishers. Back on the turnpike, Warren's patience was running thin as his generals refused to attack. Warren wanted to wait for Sedgwick, but Meade was goading him to make a move. Exasperated Warren eventually snapped and ordered the attack by Griffin's and Wadsworth's divisions over unfavorable terrain with both of their flanks hanging. The odds could not have been more stacked in Ewell's favor. Shortly past 1 p.m., Griffin's division emerged from its earthworks onto Saunders Field and advanced straight into the teeth of enemy fire. Though the first volley did little damage, subsequent volleys blasted the neatly dressed Union lines, slaughtering men in droves. Ayres's brigade of U.S. regulars and volunteer regiments was cut to pieces by enemy fire from multiple directions. On Ayres's left, Bartlett's brigade was more successful. Charging into the woods, it outflanked Jones's Confederate brigade and engaged Battle's reserve brigade. However, its position rapidly became untenable once Confederates started firing into its exposed right flank. What started as an organized retreat soon turned into a rout as the enemy converged on the isolated brigade. Many of Bartlett's men, including the general himself, barely avoided capture on their way back to Union lines. Wadsworth's men also ran into trouble. The rough terrain caused his brigades to lose their cohesion, and they unknowingly exposed their flanks or blundered straight into the enemy. When the enemy counterattacked, they promptly routed, and hundreds were captured. Later, around 3:30, Wright's men launched an attack against Ewell's line north of Warren that achieved some small successes at the expense of adding more names to the already lengthy casualty list. Neal's brigade, strengthened by some New Jersey regiments, was on the extreme right of the Union line, and his men had to slog through a marsh laced with a thick growth of prickly brush while under fire from enemies on top of a ridge. Ultimately, the attack failed, and his brigade sustained heavy casualties during the brief shootout. On the Plank Road front, Getty's division also launched an afternoon attack at the bequest of Meade. Ensconced behind their natural earthworks and concealed by dense undergrowth, Heath's Confederates were nearly invisible, and they poured a murderous fire into the Union ranks. Subsequently, Mott's and Birney's divisions of the 2nd Corps entered the battle, though they were unable to dislodge the enemy either. Specifically, Mott's division advanced in a tightly bunched group that made it an easy target for the enemy. Ultimately, Heath's 6,500-strong division successfully fended off 3 Union divisions numbering 17,000 men for nearly an hour until the arrival of Gibbon's division finally compelled it to retreat. From 5 p.m. until nightfall, seesaw fighting continued along the Plank Road as Hill's men tenaciously resisted Hancock's juggernaut. Afterward, Lee and Grant mulled over the day's engagement and formulated their respective plans for May 6th. Since Longstreet's corps was just 10 miles away, Lee intended to stay on the defensive. Meanwhile, Grant aimed to renew the offensive at dawn, for it was imperative that he destroy Lee before Longstreet arrived. Hence, he ordered Warren and Sedgwick to keep Ewell busy while Hancock delivered the knockout punch to Hill. Afterward, Burnside would move in for the kill. As planned, Hancock launched his attack against Hill at 5 a.m. Strengthened by Getty's division, 3 2nd Corps divisions advanced along the Plank Road. Simultaneously, Wadsworth's division angled in from the north. Having neglected to entrench the night before, Hill's units were caught off guard by the sudden onslaught. Although some units retreated slowly, they could not stem the tide. By 6 a.m., Hill's men were in full retreat, with the Federals right on their tails. Upon reaching Tap Field, the Union forces encountered Lieutenant William T. Pogue's cannons on the other side of the clearing. In desperation, Hill ordered Pogue to fire even though his own men were still in the way, Poe's cannoneers proceeded to send shells downrange, which opened huge gaps in the enemy lines and staggered the attack. However, it soon became apparent that unless help came quickly, Lee's army would not live to fight another day. Suddenly, Lee spotted troops approaching from the rear. Narrowing his eyes to see through the smoke, he saw that they were wearing gray and butternut uniforms. Longstreet had finally arrived. Passing Hill's shattered corps, Fields and Kershaw's divisions assembled on both sides of the road and prepared to attack. Leading the way was the famed Texas Brigade, one of Lee's most elite units. Riding up to the Texans, Lee tried leading them into battle, but they told him to go back. To their amazement, he accompanied them halfway across the field, shaking off all attempts to dissuade him, until their commander finally convinced him to turn around. Charging across Taft Field, the Texas Brigade collided with the Union troops north of the road, breaking the first line and sending the second one recoiling into the woods. Over the next 25 minutes, it traded volleys with the enemy from a distance of only 20 yards, losing 550 of its 800 men in the unequal fight. However, it had stopped the enemy advance. Following in the Texans' footsteps were Fields' remaining two brigades, and they hit the Union line in quick succession. During the advance, a deadly crossfire inflicted heavy casualties on Benning's Georgia Brigade, though Perry's Alabama Brigade succeeded in routing Wadsworth's battered division. Simultaneously, Kershaw's men slammed into the Union forces south of the road, which were running low on ammunition after hours of fighting. Mott's and Birney's divisions quickly folded under the pressure, though the Vermont Brigade managed to withstand the onslaught long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Using earthworks and the woods for cover, the Union soldiers ultimately slowed the enemy advance and mounted stubborn resistance for the next few hours. By 8 a.m., the tide was turning in favor of the Confederates. Anderson's division, which had been guarding the river, was starting to filter into Taft Field, and Hill was shifting his units north to connect with Ewell. On the turnpike front, Ewell was holding firm, and his sharpshooters and artillery were inflicting heavy casualties on Sedgwick. Similarly, the enemy fire in Warren's sector was so intense that he declined to send his men forward. Back on the plank road, the two sides continued blasting away at one another from close range with unrelenting ferocity. Finally, about 10 a.m., the firing died down as both sides paused to regroup. At this point, Longstreet started searching for another way to defeat Hancock because frontal attacks were not making any more progress. Earlier in the day, the Army of Northern Virginia's chief engineer, Major General Martin L. Smith, had scouted south of Taft Field and discovered an unfinished railroad cut astride Hancock's unprotected left flank. Upon learning of this, Longstreet promptly authorized an attack by 3 brigades, and he selected one of his staff officers, Lieutenant Colonel Moxley Sorrell, to lead it. Using the railroad cut, the column surreptitiously maneuvered onto Hancock's flank, where it waited for the fighting to die down. Sometime after 10 a.m., Sorrell's Confederates burst out of the woods and barreled into the unsuspecting soldiers of McAllister's brigade, who were resting in the shade. Hit from front and flank, they retreated in disorder, and McAllister himself barely avoided capture. Sorrell's men proceeded to overrun several other Union brigades in succession. By noon, they had effectively crushed the 20,000-plus soldiers of Hancock's left wing. North of the road, the Confederates also drove back the enemy and mortally wounded Wadsworth. Longstreet then led a party of riders down the road at the head of his troops, but nervous Confederates mistakenly identified them as Federals and opened fire, killing Brigadier General Micah Jenkins and seriously wounding Longstreet. Consequently, the attack slowed as the other commanders tried to rally their overextended troops, and this allowed Hancock's men to reform at the Brock Road intersection. When the Confederate assault came at 4:30, Hancock's men were ready. Longstreet's soldiers charged out of the woods straight into concentrated rifle and artillery fire. Pinned down, the Confederates were unable to advance for half an hour. Then, some brush near the plank road caught fire, and fanned by a strong breeze, it spread to the Union earthworks. As a result, Mott's division, plus soldiers from Ward's brigade, retreated, creating a gaping hole in the defenses. Surging over the burning earthworks, the Confederates planted their flags atop the parapet and poured into the breach. Nearby Union artillery responded with a storm of shot and shell, followed by double canister, which slaughtered the Confederates. Several brigades came to the rescue, and they sealed the breach after a 15-minute bout of close combat. The demoralized Confederates then receded into the woods, effectively ending the fighting along the plank road. On the other end of the battlefield, Gordon had been itching to attack Sedgwick's vulnerable right flank all day long. However, Ewell and his division commander, Major General Jubal Early, demurred for reasons that are still disputed. When Gordon finally received permission to attack, it was late in the day. His three-brigade assault demolished Shaler's and Seymour's brigades, capturing both generals, plus several hundred prisoners, but darkness and Union reinforcements precluded him from achieving an even greater victory. That night, both sides took stock of the carnage. Lee's army was in comparatively better shape than Grant's, having suffered about 11,000 casualties versus 18,000. Using the terrain to their advantage, his men had skillfully responded to every threat with vigor and stymied the enemy. In the process, they had vindicated their indomitable fighting spirit. Likewise, Grant knew that Lee had won this round, so there was no point in staying in the wilderness. Hence, he set his sights on the crossroads of Spotsylvania Courthouse, where in less than 2 days the armies would meet again.